The Linux you'll install in 2026 isn't the Linux that built the Internet. I want to say that plainly before we go anywhere else, because the shift happening right now under your terminal is structural, not cosmetic, and pretending otherwise does nobody any favors. Four big changes are converging at once. Immutable distributions are moving from curiosity to mainstream default. Wayland has nearly finished replacing X11 across the desktop landscape. Systemed keeps absorbing responsibilities that used to belong to a dozen separate tools. And corporate stewardship of the major distributions has quietly become the rule, rather than the exception. None of these arrived overnight, but in 2026, they are no longer arguable trends. They are the new floor. If you felt a low hum of unease scrolling through Forenix headlines or LWN.net summaries over the last year, that hum is real, and you are not imagining it. Stay with me, because I want to walk you through what is actually changing, who is upset, who is celebrating, and how to think about where you fit in the picture without rage, quitting your daily driver or panicking about a system that still, by every measurable benchmark, works better than it did 3 years ago. Start with Wayland, because that's the most visible shift. Forenix has been tracking Wayland adoption almost obsessively, and the numbers in 2026 are striking. GNOME defaults to Wayland. KDE Plasma 6 defaults to Wayland. Fedora ships X11 only as a legacy escape hatch, and even that hatch is being narrowed with each release. Ubuntu has moved its main session to Wayland for the LTS line. NVIDIA's explicit sync support, the long-delayed missing piece, finally landed in production drivers, which means the most stubborn holdout reason for staying on X11 has effectively dissolved. X11 isn't being killed. It is being retired the way an old highway gets retired. The off-ramps just slowly stop being maintained. The Zorg server itself has been in maintenance-only mode for years, and the developers who used to patch it have largely moved on to Walil Roots, Mutter, Kwin, and the broader Wayland ecosystem. Wayland's per-surface security model also stops one window from reading another's keystrokes. Good for security, inconvenient for screen readers and remote desktop tools. Gaps being closed protocol by protocol in Wayland protocols. Then look at immutable file systems. Fedora Silverblue and its atomic siblings are no longer experimental. OpenSUSE has Aeon and Kalpa shipping as full products. Ubuntu Core desktop blueprints are public, and Canonical has signaled for over a year that an immutable variant of Ubuntu is the destination, not the detour. The mechanism is RPM Ostri, or in Ubuntu's case, a snap-based root, and the practical effect is the same. Your OS becomes a versioned, transactional thing. You update, and if it breaks, you roll back. The base is read-only. Apps live in containers, separated from the OS. Underneath, RPM Ostri deduplicates files with content-addressed hashes, and the bootloader exposes the previous deployment as a one-keystroke fallback. Community discussions around Fedora Atomic and OpenSUSE's Aeon and Kalpa have been candid about both wins and friction. Users report the rollback feature has, more than once, saved them from a bad update at 3 in the morning. They also report that obscure printer drivers and kernel modules still take more lateral thinking on an immutable base because layered packages now require a deployment rebuild, which leads directly to the third shift. Flatpak and Snap are reshaping how software gets onto a Linux machine. FlatHub, the central Flatpak repository, now hosts thousands of applications, many maintained directly by upstream developers rather than distro packagers. Snap, despite years of criticism over its proprietary backend, has become the default delivery mechanism for huge swaths of Ubuntu's software. The traditional distro repository is still alive, but it is no longer the only road. And for desktop apps, it is increasingly not even the main road. The fourth shift is the one people argue about most quietly, which usually means it matters most. Systemed keeps expanding. Leonard Poettering's posts and conference talks have been clear about the trajectory. Systemed homed encrypts home directories and ties them to portable identities. Systemed networked handles networking on more distributions. Systemed resolved handles DNS. Systemed boot is replacing grub. Systemed cryptenroll handles TPM-backed disk unlocking. Greg Croa Hartman, asked about kernel-adjacent integration, has been pragmatic. The kernel is the kernel. User space is user space. And as long as the contract holds, what user space does is user space's business. But the surface area of that user space, dominated by a single integrated suite, is undeniably larger than a decade ago. Even systemed the user space out-of-memory daemon, now ships on Fedora and Ubuntu by default, intervening before the kernel's own killer can act. The unified C-group v2 hierarchy, which Systemed helped standardize, is now the substrate container runtimes and sandboxed apps share. Layered on top is the corporate stewardship question. Red Hat, now part of IBM after the 2019 acquisition, anchors upstream development across the kernel, GNOME, Systemd, GCC, GIL-IBC, and dozens of other projects. The 2020 CentOS Stream reshuffle was when longtime users felt the change, and the 2023 RHEL source RPM restrictions sent Alma Linux and Rocky Linux scrambling to rework their build pipelines. Canonical drives Ubuntu and Snap, and its delayed IPO trajectory means commercial pressure on Snap Store monetization and Ubuntu Pro is unlikely to soften. SUSE has changed hands more times than most can name. Novel, Attachmate, Micro Focus, EQT Partners, a 2021 IPO, then a 2023 take-private deal. Each pass leaving a fingerprint. Volunteer projects haven't disappeared. Debian, Arch, Gentoo, Slackware, Void, Alpine all still exist. But the center of paid development has shifted decisively toward companies whose quarterly obligations sit, eventually, in the same room as your kernel. Worth pausing on one more wrinkle of the corporate picture, because it shapes everything downstream. Red Hat employs many of the engineers who currently maintain GNOME, several kernel subsystems, glibc, and large portions of the free desktop stack. Canonical employs much of the upstream effort behind GNOME's, adjacent tooling, Mir's legacy contributions, and the Snap ecosystem. SUSE underwrites significant kernel and YIST work. None of those companies are villains, and most of the work they fund is excellent. The point is that when a sysadmin in 1998 spoke about the Linux desktop community, they were largely describing volunteers loosely federated across mailing lists. When a sysadmin in 2026 says the same phrase, they are describing a population whose paid contributors mostly answer to one of 4 or 5 companies. That is a different organism. It still functions. It also has different failure modes, and the older generation noticing that shift is not being unreasonable. Now let's talk about the unhappiness, because it is real and it isn't just nostalgia. The old guard concerns break into a few distinct anxieties. The first is vendor capture. When one company employs the maintainers of a critical component, that company's commercial priorities will, eventually, shape technical decisions. The CentOS Stream reshuffle was, for many people, the moment this stopped being theoretical. The Red Hat source access changes that followed turned a long simmering worry into a visible scar. People remember. The second concern is the App Store-ification of the desktop. If Flatpak and Snap become the dominant delivery channel, and those channels are governed primarily by FlatHub or Canonical, the relationship between user and software starts to look like macOS or Windows. There's a curated store, There's a sandbox. There's a permissions dialog. For users who came to Linux specifically to escape that model, this feels like inheriting the thing they were trying to leave. The counter-argument that FlatHub is governed by a non-profit and Flatpak is an open specification is technically correct but incomplete. Specs are open. Defaults are sticky, and the default repository on a default install is where most users will live. Here's a way to picture what's actually happening on the technical side. Imagine two generations of farmers standing at the edge of the same field, disagreeing about which side to plow first. One generation has worked that field for 30 years and knows where the rocks are, where the soil drains, where the wind cuts through. The other generation has new tools, new soil science, and a different theory of yield. Both are looking at the same dirt. Both genuinely want a good harvest. Neither is wrong about what they see. They are arguing because they each have real information the other doesn't fully trust. Why does the new camp push anyway? Because the benefits are not abstract. Immutable systems dramatically reduce a class of failure modes. I installed something 3 months ago, and now my system won't boot problem largely disappears when the base is a versioned image. Reproducibility, the holy grail of long-term system maintenance, becomes the default instead of an aspiration. Security teams love sandboxed apps because the blast radius of a compromised application is constrained. Support burden drops because every user with the same image really is running the same image, byte for byte. For organizations running thousands of Linux desktops, these are not preferences. They are operational realities that translate into staffing budgets. A help desk supporting a fleet of identical images closes tickets faster than one chasing 1,000 snowflake configurations. There is also a quieter benefit that matters more for individual users than the enterprise framing suggests. Reproducibility means that the laptop you set up 2 years ago can be replicated on a new machine in an afternoon, not a weekend. If your installation is defined by an image and a configuration, replacing hardware becomes a copy operation rather than a rediscovery. For people whose Linux histories include some painful migration weekend, that promise alone is worth the friction of learning a slightly different mental model. The reason adoption is rising in 2026, after years of immutable distributions existing as curiosities, is that the supporting tooling has finally caught up. DistroBox handles the cases where you need a mutable environment. Flatpak handles app delivery. Toolbox handles development. The triangle is complete enough that the constraints stop feeling like punishment. So where does that leave you, the person actually trying to decide what to install? Let me walk you through 4 honest paths. The first path is to embrace the new mainstream. If you've watched the trajectory and want to be ahead of it, the candidates are clear. Fedora Silverblue, or its atomic siblings Kinoite and Ceresia, give you an immutable RPM OSTree-based system with Flatpak as the primary app delivery method. Ubuntu Core Desktop, as it matures through 2026, offers a similar experience from the canonical side. The trade-offs are real. Layering packages onto an immutable base is possible but slower than apt or DNF. Some software, especially proprietary tools, doesn't yet ship cleanly as a Flatpak. And you'll find yourself learning DistroBox or Toolbox to bridge the gap. In exchange, you get rollback, reproducibility, and a system that's genuinely harder to break. If you treat your laptop like a workstation that must boot tomorrow morning, the appeal is obvious. One extra move worth making here: set up DistroBox. Or Toolbox on day 1 and use a Fedora or Arch container as your Scratch workspace, so the immutable host stops chafing the moment you need a mutable bench. The second path is to hold the line on the classic stack. If your trust in the old contract, a package manager, a file system hierarchy, mutable root, sysadmin that hasn't fundamentally changed since the 1990s, is why you use Linux at all. This path is healthy. Debian Stable, MX Linux, and Devuan are the three names to know. Debian Stable gives you the largest carefully curated traditional repository in Linux, with a release cadence measured in years and a governance model resistant to single-vendor capture. MX Linux builds on Debian with sysvinit as a first-class option and a toolset oriented toward administrators who want visibility. Devuan goes further, removing systemed entirely for OpenRC or Runit. The trade-offs are real. Newer hardware support lags. Some Wayland-only desktop features are awkward or unavailable. This is also the path with the deepest documentation. 20 years of forum posts, wiki entries, and manual pages aimed at exactly this configuration. One extra recommendation on this lane: pair your install with apt list bugs and apt list changes, so every upgrade surfaces the relevant Debian bug reports before you commit to it. The third path is the hybrid pragmatist route, where a large share of viewers will land. Linux Mint and Pop! OS represent a middle road. Modern enough to support current hardware, conservative enough to keep a traditional package management model, and a familiar administrative surface. Mint's Cinnamon Edition runs on X11 by default in 2026. With Wayland as an option, you can flip when you're ready. Pop! OS, with its in-development Cosmic desktop, is Wayland native, but still ships a conventional Debian Ubuntu base. These are the distributions you recommend to a friend who wants Linux to work without becoming a research project, precisely because they refuse to commit fully to either pole. Fedora Workstation also fits this lane, still a traditional DNF-based system, with the immutable variants sitting beside it as siblings rather than successors. One extra practice on this path: run a Flatpak, a snap, and a repo install of the same tool side by side for a week, and notice which one you actually reach for. The fourth path is to roll your own. Arch, Gentoo, and NixOS each represent a different philosophy of self-determination. Arch gives you a rolling release base where you assemble exactly the stack you want, piece by piece, from the wiki up. Gentoo lets you compile from source and configure at the USE flag level, trading time for control. NixOS reframes the problem. The system is declarative, defined, in a configuration file, and every change is a function, producing a new generation you can roll back to atomically. NixOS achieves many of the same goals as the immutable mainstream distros while taking a different technical route. If the appeal of an immutable Fedora is the rollback, but you want to define the system yourself, NixOS may be the destination you didn't know you were looking for. The trade-off is time. Self-determined systems repay attention with control, and punish neglect with strange failure modes no vendor will help you diagnose. One extra recommendation on this path: version your configuration in Git from the first commit, whether that's an Arch package list, a Gentoo make.conf, or a NixOS flake, so a hardware failure costs you minutes instead of a weekend. Now, a necessary pause. None of these camps is wrong. No camp has won, and in 2026, no camp is close to winning. If you're new to Linux, don't pick your distribution based on ideology. Pick it based on what you need the machine to do this week. Install something widely supported: Fedora Workstation, Ubuntu LTS, or Linux Mint. Get comfortable and learn what choices actually matter to you before committing to a philosophical lane. The technical disagreements are genuine, but they're also the disagreements of people who already decided Linux is worth caring about. Here is the thing I want you to take away, more than any specific distro recommendation. Every healthy ecosystem fights about what counts as the real version of itself. Photography fought about digital versus film. Music fought about analog versus digital. Architecture has been fighting about modernism versus tradition for a century. In each case, the argument was not a sign of decline. It was a sign that the thing being argued about still mattered enough to be worth defending from multiple directions. That is precisely what is happening to Linux right now. The system skeptics, the Wayland holdouts, the immutable evangelists, the arch-maximalists, the NixOS theorists, the Debian conservatives, every one of those camps is putting time and energy into Linux because Linux is, to them, worth the fight. The shipwright arguments at the dry dock are loud, but the ship is being rebuilt because the cargo has changed. Disagreement, in a project this size, is not the death rattle. It is the oxygen. A Linux that everyone agreed about would be a Linux nobody cared about anymore. And we would know the ecosystem was dying because the arguments would have stopped. They have not stopped. They have intensified because the stakes are higher than they have ever been. Linux runs the cloud, the phone in your pocket, the car in your driveway, and increasingly, the laptop on your desk. Of course, people are going to argue about its future. The arguing is the work. What I'd add, gently, is this. If you are new to Linux, and you have been watching these arguments from a distance and feeling intimidated, do not be. The arguments sound enormous because the people having them care enormously. From the inside, none of these camps would object to your presence on the wrong side of their disagreement. The Arch user will help you install Mint. The Fedora developer will recommend Debian for your aging server. The immutable evangelist will hand you a USB stick with Pop! OS on it. The actual practice of the community, when it meets a newcomer, is overwhelmingly hospitable. The shouting matches you read about online are a thin slice of a much larger and friendlier ecosystem. The thing you have stumbled into is not a battlefield. It is a workshop where the craftsmen disagree about tools because they have spent decades caring about the work. So drop a comment and let me know. Which camp are you in? Are you all in on Immutable and Wayland, holding the line on Debian Stable and Sysvinit, riding the middle on Mint or Pop, or rolling your own on Arch, Gen2, or NixOS? I read these, and the genuinely interesting picture of where Linux is going in 2026 is going to come out of your answers, not mine. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, the channel runs on it, so subscribe and stick around. There's more coming. The arguments aren't slowing down, and honestly, I wouldn't want them to.